Throughout this course, we've talked about explicit criteria and we've talked about rubrics. This presentation is going to get more into the specifics of what is a rubric and how do we create a good rubric. This slide shows the structure of a rubric. There are criteria listed along the left-hand side and point values across the top, and the very important descriptors which are located in each box for each point value and criteria. Here's an example of a rubric. If you'll note on the far left-hand column, those are the criteria: container, ice cream toppings, quantity of topping, whipped cream, and to top it off. Across the first row are the scale points, 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is a 1 through 4 rubric. Now remember, these descriptors are based on what the developer thought they should be. You may not agree with it, but if you're the rubric creator, you get to say what is the criteria and what is the descriptor for each point value. So for example, toppings, we'll start right in the middle. To get a 1, you get 1 topping. If you put 2 toppings that are compatible, then you would get 2 points. 3 compatible toppings would give you 3 points, and 3 compatible toppings that include chocolate would give you 4 points. Again, whoever wrote this rubric, that was their ideal of a best ever sundae. It might not match yours. Therefore, when you create a rubric, you get to decide what the criteria are and what the scale or point values mean. There are 2 basic types of rubrics. There are analytical rubrics and holistic rubrics. The analytical rubric is formative in nature. This is what you would give to students so as they are working on a project or a paper, they can use the descriptors to help guide them through the tasks or series of tasks. The product is evaluated according to several separate criteria. So the best ever sundae rubric would be an analytical rubric. A holistic rubric is summative. That's used to evaluate the product or performance as a whole, and with a single score assigned to the work. So once it is all said and done, you get a single score, and we will look at some different types of rubrics as we continue. This is an example of an analytical rubric. Again, you have multiple criteria this time, and you will get point values in each of those criteria, so that a student can also use this to determine and help guide them how to create a bar graph. Here's another example of an analytical rubric. This is the Adams School rubric, and it talks about the area, organization of information, formulas, solution method, and measurements. So as you go across the top, you have the point values 1 through 4, and again a series of descriptors. Here is the format for a holistic rubric. You'll have a point value and multiple descriptors, then a lower point value and more descriptors. Doesn't matter if it is a vertical or horizontal, as you'll see in the next slide. These are some examples of holistic rubrics. You'll note that the learner can learn how they will get full points, but ultimately they will only get a single score on, in this case, the letter recognition of A, or the number recognition 5. This one's not pretty, but it gives you another holistic rubric example so that you can see the various descriptors for getting a level 5, a level 4, 3, 2, 1 on this particular oral presentation. You'll see that the subject line is in each of the criteria in this case. So for a 5, the subject is addressed clearly. In 4, the subject is addressed adequately. For 3, subject is addressed also adequately. In 2, the speech needs more explanation, and the speech does not address the topic. So this will provide you the guidance to know what pretty looks like, and the key part or critical part as the teacher is you need to be able to clearly articulate, like in this example of the subject, what does it mean to be clear? What does it mean to be adequate? And students need to understand that as well. Each rubric has a purpose, whether it is formative or if it is summative. The formative is not only a scoring or grading tool, but it is a tool to help students learn along the way. Summative is for a final project. There's nothing wrong with either of them. It's just knowing which to use in which situation and to be clear of whether this is going to be summative or formative. For example, on the Best Ever Sunday, it is formative. You can also get a summative grade, but it is formative if I am able to use the feedback and improve my Sunday. So, for example, I bring the sundaes to the table and I only have 2 toppings. I didn't put whipped cream on, and I didn't have a cherry on top or whatever else was critically important to cover the top of my sundae. But what I need to be able to do then is to go back, if it is a formative, and I need to improve my sundae until I get a final score. Then that analytical rubrics has served 2 purposes, both formative and summative. The holistic rubric is primarily a summative tool. Both are appropriate in different situations. Now we're going to build a rubric. First, you need to create a checklist of the criteria and the components necessary for successful completion of a task. This is part of your written assignments for this week, so have fun with it. Do one like the sundaes or creating a wonderful dinner or a great date, whatever. Be creative and have a little bit of fun. Also, then you need to establish a scale. 1 through 3, 1 through 5, 1 through 4, and then write descriptors for each criterion or component at each level of the scale. When you are determining the point scale for your rubric, there's really not a lot of magic involved. You need to determine the scale to best meet your needs. Some things to consider, though, is that if you use an odd number for your point scale, people tend to travel to the middle, and you have scoring or grading that tends to the middle rather than key criteria. So it's not wrong to have a odd number, but it's something to take into consideration. So a recommendation would be to generally have a even number of criteria, so 4 or 6. One thing you have to consider, though, is that you have to be able to write distinct descriptors for each of the number of points chosen. This gets difficult if the scale has more than 4 points. Feel free to do it if you can articulate and clearly tell the difference between each of the point values for each of the criteria. This is the tricky part. If you can do it, terrific. If not, limit the number of points that you can get. A complex task might warrant larger point scales. So again, an easier project, a smaller project, 1 through 3, 1 through 4. Complex could go up higher to have 8 points, 6 points. But again, you must be able to describe each of those point values for each of the criteria. I know. Here we go again. Verbs, verbs, verbs. When you're developing a rubric, as you build criteria, just as you build any assessment, using verbs to get to different depths of knowledge is critical. So again, pull out your verb lists, use those to help, because that gets at, especially for an analytical rubric, that gets to the quality. A lower score may be just a knowledge verb that they described, they predicted, they judged. A higher level could be that they compared and contrast, they explained. So use verbs to create your descriptors, just as you use verbs to create better standards or assessment questions to get at different depths of knowledge and learning. Some more points on writing descriptors, other than verbs, of course. Your descriptors or indicators should help your students understand the components of the task, but also the quality. You need to be precise, avoid negatives, and a good way to build one of these is to take an exemplar for a project that has been done in the past. So if you're creating a rubric, take several students and line them up from the weaker to the greatest exemplar. Use those key student work pieces to help you build your descriptors. It will help you to clarify because you have something to look at. Then you can use those exemplars when sharing with your students the rubric and the descriptor of what pretty looks like. Write a descriptor for each criterion at each level of quality. Okay, here we go. Let's write a rubric. First, you need to create a rubric for your, let's say, your favorite food, candy bar, restaurant, date, perfect holiday, great vacation, whatever. You're going to need to develop descriptors, criteria, and point values. You're going to post your wonderful rubric and then provide excellent feedback to 3 of your peers. So again, go back to the PowerPoint, go through the key components of a rubric, and help your fellow students create very strong rubrics. Writing rubrics is not easy, especially to get at those items of quality that help students. So check out those verbs, helps your fellow students enhance and develop their rubrics. Related to the rubric is the checklist. A checklist is a yes-no guide that students can use for some self-assessment. The checklist is a list of criteria in which to judge the performance or product that a student is creating. It should include the elements necessary to lead the students to success. Does not need to be an exhaustive list, but it needs to be closely related to the components that will create success. The checklist either has that the item is absent or it is present. A checklist does not define quality. So that's important to remember. If you're using a checklist, this is not about quality. If you want to get at quality, you need to write a rubric. Here's an example of a checklist. This one is for persuasive speech. The items that are necessary for success is that it has to have organization, content, delivery, and visual aids. The bullet points give us more detail, but let's look at one in particular. Hook that engages the reader. You've got it or you don't. This doesn't really tell us a lot about how to develop a hook or what a developing hook is compared to one that exceeds. This is just so students are certain that they have all of the necessary components of the project. Here's another example of a checklist for a science project. The part that I like about this is that it's not a yes or no, it's a yes and not yet. This helps students realize that every work takes time. It's not bad if you forget something. It's only disappointing if you don't go back and include the item you're missing. So the yes and not yet helps the student realize that they have time to go back and make certain all the component parts are present. Here's just another example of a checklist with the yes and not yet component. I used this slide earlier, and again, I really like this. Student can hit any target they can see and that doesn't move. That's what a rubric is. It's the target that students can see and use to get a good quality project or task done.